Well, hey there, and welcome to episode number 505 of 6 Pixels of Separation, the Mirum Podcast. My name is Mitch Joel. It's Sunday, March the 13th, 2016. Let's get on with the show. So, who are you and what do you do?
My name is David Burkus. I am an author of 2 books now, a host of a podcast called Radio Free Leader, and a recovering academic.
Nice. Dr. David, how are you?
I'm good. No, I've only recently come to terms with that term recovering academic. Like, I don't know if it was before I had the first book out or the second book or somewhere between the first book and the second book, I realized that I was finally okay telling the world that I'm a terrible researcher and that I'm much more excited about writing about other people's research and such. Like, it's weird. As an academic, you're not supposed to admit that, right? You're supposed to be sort of competitive on who does. But you know what? I'm never going to do amazing research like Angela Duckworth or those type of people. So in the meantime, I enjoy writing about other people's research.
So are you moving away from that world of academia, or is it just more the research thing that you're moving away from?
It's more the research thing. I mean, I deliberately chose to work for a university that doesn't really promote people based on research. It's based primarily on teaching and other activities. And you know, I undergraduate, I was a writing major. I mean, writing the books and all of that was always the goal. I became fascinated with people like Dan Pink and Malcolm Gladwell when I was at university, and the whole reason I went to grad school was more to learn about this stuff so that I could better understand it and then later write about it. And so for a time, in order to kind of get academic positions, et cetera, you've got to do research and be published in these journals nobody reads. But that never really gave me passion. And so the idea of writing about other people's really good research that maybe hasn't been translated into an easily applicable type format, that's way more exciting to me. And I'm sort of arrived at that place. I'm in a good position with my relationship with the university and all that sort of stuff where I can do that. So it's really quite exciting.
But that is that's the sort of like, if you love people like Gladwell, I mean that's the sort of secret sauce that he has. You know, if you study the background, not his work, but how he creates his work. This is a guy who spends a ton of time in strange libraries all throughout New York City, looking at obscure pieces of data and research that most people probably ignored in journals, as you said, people don't read. And he tries to align that with something that's going on in some format of our culture, whether it's popular or not. And he builds, I mean, I really think his platform is built off of this sort of nerdiness of him being in some dusty old corner looking at some publication, academic pub that no one knows about.
Oh yeah, no, totally, and I'm very similar. Like I can geek out on p-values and sample sizes and confounding factors and all of that sort of stuff. But in order to create that research, you basically have to sit in a room and give tests to undergraduates for hours on end, and that part just doesn't excite me. So I love sort of geeking out on all of it, and I'm glad I sort of studied it all. But the act of creating it, it's not as exciting to me as the act of like opening up Scrivener and actually writing about something instead.
But you are a doctor.
I know. Well, I should be honest.
You play one in books.
I play one in books. I fight with both of my editors because I don't like putting the doctor on the cover. Like, I don't know if that's. I guess it's sort of like I feel like if the ideas inside the book are good, the DR in front or PhD in the back, it shouldn't help, right? So. Part of it is I fight that. The other reason is that, as you know, I'm married to an ER doctor, so I know that I'm always not that kind of doctor. Like I'm always the other type of doctor. So it just feels, as I tell people often, like Dr. Burkus is my wife, Mr. Burkus is my dad. So just call me Dave and let's talk.
But I think it would be great to have that airplane scenario, the movie Airplane, where it's because on your ticket we need a doctor, and you're like, I do research, I don't I have nothing to do with health sciences.
Yeah, no, totally.
So you've got this brand new book out called Under New Management. And I'm always interested in the catalyst for books and where that inspiration comes from, and then the compilation of stuff, because you and I are cut from the same type of cloth in terms of being really public in places like Facebook and Twitter and blogging and posting and writing articles and stuff. And the old world was you worked in silence until you had a book. And if you loved an author, you just waited like a year, 2 years for them to release their new piece. And I feel there's a generation of people who do the thinking and the work like you and I do, where every day there's a whole bunch of stuff that we're putting out into the world, even if it's just curated stuff. And then, but there are these moments in time every year, every couple of years where we do books. And your first book, The Myths of Creativity, again, was sort of research based, looking at what we really know about where creativity comes from. And then under new management comes across my radar. We were talking about it as you were in the writing process and development process of it. And I look at it and I go, well, okay, so Dave is going to talk about the principles of business management, and his area of focus is going to be, yeah, guess what? They're completely outdated and not working. And I thought, well, this is something that is either going to be spectacularly brilliant or he's going to get a lot of arrows in his back, because in this digital transition and the world we're going through, and transformation and disruption, whatever you want to call it, there are a lot of people who might argue back that, well, with all of the change, the core principles of business management are completely the same, and it's silly to think otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, I get both actually. I get both like scepters and arrows in some regard, because you're right. I get. I was actually, I wasn't expecting as much of that pushback as I got, but I also wasn't expecting as much like, yay, this is exactly right, and I've been wishing that my company or my, not the nonprofit I work for, et cetera, would do that. And I think the rationale that I have is this, like the example I use at the very end of the book is sort of my example of why things have to change. And it's a weird analogy, but it's the only thing I remember from my physics class. And that is that the internal combustion engine is only about 30% efficient, meaning not fuel efficiency, but like 30% of the energy that's in gasoline gets turned into forward motion. The rest gets lost to heat and friction and all sorts of other things. And in a weird way, I think organizations are the same way. We have these fundamental core principles of management, yes, and they work, but they only work if you're willing to accept a really low level of efficiency. And in my case, I think as we shifted from an industrial age to a knowledge work economy, the best measure of that is the employee engagement measures. And I feel like every management author cites this quote, so I always feel awful talking about it. But the truth is, for decades, we haven't moved much further than 2 out of 10 people being fully engaged in their job. 2 out of 10, maybe 3 out of 10 in the United States. That's like the ceiling on engagement. And what that means is that only about 30% of the mental energy of people, only 30% of somebody's whole self and whole focus and whole creative energies is being captured by an organization, which is the same as that sort of internal combustion engine. We can say that an automobile works, but thank God there are people like Elon Musk who are trying to transform transportation, go to electric cars, something that'll be more fuel efficient. And I love that act of tinkering. And I think there are people who are doing the same thing in organizations. They're tinkering with different policies and practices and procedures and assumptions, like you said. And the goal is to get that number up and to redesign the factory, as it were, to get that number up. And I don't pretend, that I have all of these sort of answers. And I think the people that are slinging arrows are making assumptions that I'm saying every company needs to do every single one of these. But really what I want to do is point out that like these are a variety of different experiments that are working to raise that number and are working to get people more engaged, more motivated, performing better, being more energized at work or when they leave work, and just in general, having a better work life. And so I think we ought to consider them, and we ought to consider which ones are right for our organization, and we're not going to apply them all. But if we can apply them and we can move the needle from, 20% to 35% to 40 to 50%, if you could have a coin flip's chance of finding a job that energizes you, that'd be awesome.
But let's push that, because I think it's an important statement. There's no doubt about it. You want people to come to work and feel engaged and feel validated and feel like they're part of something. But there's also output on the other side. And I'm not saying it's one or the other. I do feel that a lot of the companies that are talked about in your book, and just even by me and when I'm writing and doing my thing too, that I often wonder, like, this is all great. And like, yeah, we're looking at employee, but at the end of the day, the company does exist to sell more products, sell more services, and ultimately add value to the community. And I feel like the problems that we have, and I'm sort of riffing off of, like, right now I'm very engrossed in Douglas Rushkoff, and I've known Doug forever, and his work always very much impacts me and has me take a contrarian view to even things I believe are true. And his new book, Throwing Rocks to Google Bust, there's a lot of interesting perspectives about the fact that yes, businesses are doing all this and it looks so good and they have unicorn evaluations, but at the end of the day, it's a lot less people working in organizations that are producing a lot less. In fact, a lot of these organizations really don't produce anything but their own acquisition.
Hmm.
And that so it's nice to have all of these things and have employees super happy, but at the end of the day, it's actually hurting the greater good and it's hurting the economy and it's hurting the infrastructure. And at the end of the day, after your 18 months of tenure, there's not going to be any work for you.
Yeah. So two thoughts on that. The first is I think, it's to me it's a lot more than kind of the perks and that sort of thing. And when I started looking into these ideas, like you had said that we're involved in social all of the time, and one of the cool benefits is in addition to putting out like little things, we also observe lots of little things. And I kept seeing those examples. Google is so much a cliche when it comes to perks now, but then you see the other crazy things like unlimited vacation at Netflix and salary transparency, you're paying people to quit, all these things that just seem like, wow, that's so new, unique, that's crazy, et cetera. But then when you look at it through the lens of an organizational psychologist, which is what I studied in graduate school, you start to realize the reasons behind why these ideas are sort of working. And to me, it boils down to this, right? Like at the end of the day, it is about productivity. It is about creating a product. It is about creating value for consumers, et cetera. But where do those products come from these days? They don't come from a factory floor. They come from in between the two ears of the people who work there, right? We shifted from the best analogy I've ever heard is Roger Martin, an intellectual hero of mine, calls it sort of we're no longer in the physical factory, we're in a decision factory. Most people's jobs are to make decisions, come up with ideas, or solve problems, right? And all of that occurs in the mind. And so the idea is we used to design organizations and we designed all of the sort of fundamental principles of how you run an organization. And it was based off the idea of keeping the line, keeping the production line running efficiently. Well, the production line's in somebody's head now. And so we need to sort of shift from looking at how do we develop the product and then making all the other org design decisions based on that to our person and what's best for our team of people and make all those other design decisions there. Now, the other point I would make is that I look at a lot of these companies as right at the forefront of a lot of shifts that most companies have to have. And the ones that are making the shift now are attracting a lot of that talent. And the interesting thing is that you're finding that you sort of need less and less of it because it's more about sort of the ideas than the brute force and labor. But it's also this sort of disparity. I mean, I believe because the talented people sort of migrate to that. Like one of the chapters in here is called Ban Non-Competes, and it comes from the research of a brilliant law scholar, Orly Lobel, and she actually has a book called Talent Wants to Be Free, and it's basically this idea that your most talented employees are going to be hindered by all of these different non-competes and non-disclosure agreements, et cetera. And so getting rid of them becomes a talent magnet in essence. I think all of these policies are that way. These practices, if they're people-centered, they're going to attract a lot of talent and create sort of that inequity. And so to me, it's sort of like if you can't beat them, join them. The only sort of rational decision is for every organization to look and go, okay, what can we do to align ourselves with this? Otherwise, we're going to see a flood of talent disappearing and we're going to create that discrepancy. So that's a lot of part of it. The Google buses thing, I think, is totally different. We've got a broader sort of societal thing, which I touch on a little bit in looking at the chapters in the book that talk about how organizations exist inside of sort of a broader network. And it's not just about you, it's about the stakeholders and all of that sort of thing. But really my goal for this was to sort of promote the thesis that we need to stop designing an organization to make a product efficiently and design it around people to allow people to make the product most efficiently.
And this stuff does fall into buckets. And I guess, as you're talking, I'm thinking about, a message I get all the time, which I'm sure you could empathize with, is the idea that, the 4 Ps of marketing are completely antiquated and they're outdated. They're not working. And I'm like, oh, okay. 4 Ps of marketing: product, price, promotion, place, right? What's your product? Place, where is it distributed? Promotion, right? I think you could take all these new things. You might be able to say, listen, you can do such great targeting, do all this stuff, but at the end of the day, it could still fit into one of those 4 buckets. And I'm always, yeah, I'm very much I guess in a world of being someone who's considered to be at that sort of front space of digital and marketing and communications and media, I actually still think that the four P's are the core of what we do at the end of the day. Business management, it's still about how we manage the operation. So if we're shifting from a mentality of the people don't matter, it's the output of the product to a place where we say the people matter. And by people mattering, we're actually going to get a better product output. It still fits into our buckets, if you know what I mean.
Oh no, you're totally right, and it's one of the reasons. I mean, this was I don't know if you've encountered this, but choosing a book title is
No.
absolute agony,
If I
right?
don't have the book title, I don't have a book. So
Yeah,
I can't work the other way.
okay, so that was the case with Mists of Creativity. Like the title sort of came as, I mean, actually, truthfully, it was that I absolutely loved Scott Berkin's book, The Myths of Innovation, and so I thought, like, well, what are the similar myths we have about how people come up with ideas? And then you're like, then you've got a structure, right? Okay, it's myth, so each chapter is a myth. This is perfect. This one was always supposed to be a collection of I shudder to call them best practices, et cetera. It's 2016, and you're writing a book about management. You're supposed to throw management under the bus and talk about leadership. But what you said right there was one of the reasons I wanted to make sure that management was still in the title, because it's not about. I mean, I even there's an irony. I even have a chapter called "Fire the Managers." But what I mean by that is not that people can exist without a management function. It's that the different roles that managers do, tracking performance, providing resources, et cetera, can be done by teams in certain organizations. Not every organization, but it's exactly what you said, like the four Ps. It's not that one person's job is the four Ps, or now one person's job is the five different activities that managers do. It's that there are different ways that we can meet those activities inside the organization without calling it that sort of traditional manager subordinate role. And so that's why we arrived at this idea of under new management. It's not that we need to sort of throw away management and it's over and let's only talk about leadership, et cetera. It's that management needs new management. In other words, like the management needs a new set of tools. And it's kind of funny because I opened the book with a talk about Frederick Taylor, who is sort of the person that created the foundation for management. And he was notorious for, there's one story where he was working with a factory and discovered that if you were shoveling coal into a furnace, the human body could optimally shovel 21 and a half pounds of coal. And there was no shovel that could hold 21 and a half pounds. So he created one, right? But here we are 100 years later, and the activities still need to be done, but maybe we need a different shovel. Maybe we need a different tool, a different tactic because of the way other things have changed. So it's totally not about, doing away with management. It's about management needs new management. Those activities always still have to get done. But I think when you move from product to person, that means you have to do them slightly differently. Like you said with the four Ps, you do them slightly differently, but they still fit inside that framework.
Now, is this stuff really, really working? So you talk about management needs new management. There's a flattening of that role. If you look at a deep extension of that, I guess that's the trend of what it's called holacracy. Zappos is going through this, and I don't know if we can tell what's happening because it's just media reporting. But when you look at the media reporting, it sounds pretty scary, and people are unsure. Love Roger Martin. I also happen to love Henry Mintzberg, who I've had on the show, happens to live here in Montreal, and he's very infamous for having that book, Managers, Not MBA,
Yeah.
and not MBAs. And his theory, which I think is very interesting and holds more water to me than some of these other ideas, is that management in and of itself is an art form. Just like you would have a developer, or you would have a creative director, or you would have business development. Management in and of itself, how we get people to come together, to collaborate, to be multidisciplinary, to bring all their brains to work, to create seamless flow in the organization. And if we flatten that and we give these roles or the components of what a manager has done, and sort of like untether it and give it to people, that we may in fact be giving more work to people where it's not their necessary skill set. We might be putting more pressure on them to self-manage and do things where they themselves might need leadership to understand how to be good at that skill set. And I often I look at a lot of these models, as you do, and I'm curious your thoughts because you wrote the book on this stuff now.
Well, I wrote a book on
book,
it,
yeah,
not the book.
not the.
But
Well,
yeah.
hopefully, if it does well, it can be the book. Like,
Oh, yeah,
Dave,
that'll work.
stick
I'll
with
go
me,
with
Dave.
it.
Yeah, we're friends. I'm trying to. So I look at that and it is like it's something where, even as a content creator, how often, oh, we need more people in the organization blogging like Mitch is doing. And I'm like, well, it's fair. I mean, I think that's a fair statement, but how many people in the organization spent their entire life writing and honing those skills and building those chops and then taking on blogging and understanding how it works as another type of publishing medium versus I'd like to write. And there's that level of things where it's like, I'd like to lead people. I'd like to, but actually doing it is you have to train, you have to learn, you have to know years of experience. And I worry about a lot of these models of management needs new management because I don't know if the people we're passing these responsibilities on to have the skill set or want that skill set.
Yeah, yeah, no, I agree. I mean, so my jury is still out on holacracy. I actually my editor kept forwarding me articles about what was going on in that, and I kept telling him like I'm not going to write about that, not going to because it might implode. I don't know what will happen. It may be the most amazing, revolutionary thing since Frederick Taylor. Probably not, but I don't know. The jury's still out on that, right? What I believe is actually that there's no one best, like holacracy builds itself as an operating system that can be installed in any organization. I don't believe that. I'm a huge fan of Mintzberg and Martin are actually aligned in their concept of strategy,
Much,
the
yeah.
idea that it's much more emergent, that you do experiments, you test and you refine. And that's really that's what I believe applies to sort of how you manage people too, is it's not about everyone should do this. In fact, I was actually really careful in the way that I wrote each chapter of the book, because each chapter is a different idea. And each chapter sort of opens with the big story. Zappos pays people to quit, and here's why it works. And then it delves into sort of the science behind it all. But then we look at 2 or 3 other examples of people who do it slightly differently. They're aligned with the core idea and the research, but they do it a little bit differently than this one company. And that was deliberately to sort of send the message that your organization is going to do this a little bit differently. And here's, with respect to Mintzberg, I agree with him that it's an art form, but actually I believe that management is, and this is probably influenced by who I've been married to and who I've watched work for 10 years, but I think that management is a lot like medicine, in that medicine is both an art and a science. There is evidence-based medicine. There's a lot of research and algorithms that we can benefit, but there's also this sort of internal experience and intuition, which is, I would define intuition as seeing a set of symptoms and then knowing all of the research and being able to kind of make a guess and begin an experimentation process. But it goes back and forth between art and science. And I think management is the same way. So my sort of goal is to write a book that, to the people who maybe have only trained in a certain system, only learned a certain way to manage people or a certain way to design an organization, to say there's other ways, and science points at other reasons why these other ways might work. Your job isn't to sort of adopt every policy and under new management. Your job is to internalize the models, and then look at your organization and go, okay, how can we apply this in our organization? It's going to look different than Zappos. It's going to look different than Netflix. It's going to look different from all of these other places because it's our organization. But again, it goes back to that sort of art and science thing. And you can't just know one or the other. If you're just relying on intuition and your gut, you're going to make a lot of decisions that science already could have told you are terrible. And if you're just relying on sort of the science side, then you're going to implement a lot of stuff modeling after sort of best practices being code for stuff that worked somewhere else and we have no promise it'll work here. And you can't really do either. You have to sort of find that balance. I think management is a lot like medicine. It's both art and science. And I think I don't know if he intended that, but that was the point that I got out of reading Managers, Not MBAs, was this idea that MBAs are skilled in the quantitative. We can look at a spreadsheet and make a decision. And you can't do that if you're going to be a manager. You have to make an informed decision based on that spreadsheet, but you also have to add the art element of knowing and using your intuition on what's right for your team or your organization.
But I push that further. I don't know, Dave. I would also say that what he was talking about is touching. You have to be in the mix with those people, and that a lot of people manage the way you just described it. And I think what he's talking about is actually putting that aside and getting into the work and helping these teams get more productive and working with them side by side and moving it forward. And if your job is to do what your job is, plus manage yourself and your team, your productivity could in fact be very much stifled. And at the same time, you could be going into a place where you wind up making yourself unemployable because you're just not that great at it.
Yeah, I mean, that's true to a point, but I think to another point, there's an awful lot to be said for focusing on what the actual sort of team needs and being down in the trenches. And even if there is sort of a team lead, it doesn't look like the traditional manager and
Right.
then, good little soldier model. It looks like somebody who's in the pack with us and who's doing that additional thing. And one of the companies that I most admire for sort of figuring this out is Sumall, based in New York. They're a social media analytics company, and they have sort of team leads that come up on temporary shifts for to manage sort of a certain project, right? So the team kind of votes and basically decides this person's going to be manager for the next few months, and it's a temporary thing, and then you fold kind of back into the team, or you decide that you really liked that and you'd rather shift your skill set from what you used to do to being able to manage these things. But again, it comes out sort of organically. The system most of us are in now is you were really, really good at your job, so we're going to make you a manager, which you may or may not be good at, and you have no way of knowing whether or not you're going to enjoy until you take the plunge. And then, of course, we're a hierarchical organization, so it looks really bad on your resume if you step back down into doing the work. But something where we allow kind of that management function to come out of the team, whether that is an official labeled role or whether that's spread throughout the team, I think it actually allows people to test and experiment with these new responsibilities and whether or not they like them. And if they like them and they move more into management, that's awesome. If they don't, then we've saved ourselves with a really valuable individual contributor staying in that role. Of course, that creates all sorts of compensation problems because you've got to figure out how to compensate individual contributors who are highly productive as much as the sort of managers. And we're really bad at that, but we're getting better at it.
When I was reading the book, I kept bouncing back to I found myself stopping a lot and thinking to myself, well, is this really a book on business management, or is this a book on workplace innovation? And then I was like, well, what's the difference? I sort
Oh,
of was
no, it's exactly,
like in
exactly.
this place where I was like, oh, this is like I kept feeling like he's talking about like how to innovate at work, not necessarily the practice of business management in many instances. And it led me when I started, again, you could sort of graze through just the chapter titles, or you could, read the whole book. And in my brain, I thought, well, so these are, whether or not it's business management or innovation at work, put that aside, Dave is focusing on companies that have been hyper innovative. A lot of the innovation that you're defining is actually what I would call the internal stuff, like it's a stuff of how things work. And of course, being the sort of more thinking person that I am, I thought, well, are these companies really going to quote unquote win? We can define what win means, but let's say win. Or are these just sort of cute things that are being put out into a world that is in this amazing moment of, again, transformation, disruption, whatever you want to call it, positive, negative, or neutral? But we're talking about them like we found the solution. And I don't know if the jury's out on any of this stuff yet.
I mean, I don't know either. I
You
certainly,
got to know you
I,
wrote a book.
no, I know. I certainly lean towards them, but there are times where I don't know that I 100% agree with even, or that I would, based on my experiences, if I were running my organization, I would implement these sort of things. The biggest insight in the book, actually wasn't from me, which I guess is humbling, but also that's kind of the way it should be. It was actually from Dane Atkinson at Sumall. We were doing like our third or fourth interview, and I write mostly about Sumall or I started writing about him because of the transparencies chapter. But then I found that they practiced a lot of the other things that I was writing about. And we started having these other conversations where Dane was like legitimately interested in like, oh, so what are the other ideas you're writing about? And we even have conversations about, oh, we don't do it this way, but now maybe we'll start doing it this way. And at one point he just sort of threw out and he just goes, well, that's what it's all about, isn't it? And I said, I was like, huh? And he goes, well, great leaders don't innovate products. They innovate the factory. And I just I stopped. It was like, that's, and I made the mistake of putting that at the end of the book where no one's going to read it unless they made it all the way to the end. I probably should have opened with that statement because that's what I think it's about is product innovation is always, it always happens after innovating that sort of factory, metaphorical factory, but innovating the organization. It always happens sort of after the people thing. And so I think a lot of that is because the industrial to knowledge work shift. Your people are the people that are coming up with these ideas now. And so your job as the manager, as the leader of the organization, is to figure out how do we reinvent the factory in such a way that we can leverage that. I mean, you look at almost any sort of product innovation, it was always preceded by a structure that kind of allowed that to happen. And history is filled with good ideas for product innovations that were in the wrong organization, and so they never sort of flourished. But in the right organization, they kind of did. And so if you want to kind of stay competitive with that as the top level of the organization, the leader, the senior managers, your job is to sort of focus in on what innovations do we need to make to the workplace so that those product innovations can actually happen.
and it's funny because I know you had highlighted that quote and you had talked about that quote, and it was Dave Atkinson from that company, Sumall, and it was great leaders don't reinvent the product, they reinvent the factory. And again, when you see a quote and you're like, yeah, and like you get excited about it, and you're like, I read it and I'm rereading it, I'm looking, I'm trying to deconstruct it. And I thought, well, it's interesting because a lot of the more forward thinking about the workplace, and you talk about this as well, the gig economy is actually about removing the factory from this. I mean, if you look at what people see as the sort of leading future-based corporations, a lot of them talk about actually thinking only about the product and getting rid of the factory.
Well, I mean, so in one capacity, I mean, I use factory as a metaphor, right? Like,
Right.
so Charles Handy was like super ahead of his time. If you ever want to actually, it's weird. If you want to understand what's going on in 2016, read The Age of Unreason, which is like 30 years old, but he called it again and again and again. And he talks about different organizational forms like the Clover organization and all sorts of other things. And that's really the idea, is that I don't think we can define the factory as like a physical factory, or we could even define it as the organization, meaning who's on payroll. But it's really not about that anymore. And it's one of the reasons, like I end the book with the celebrate departures idea, the idea that when people leave your organization, they're still connected to your organization. And honestly, it might behoove you to look at them as still part of it. If they're still communicating, if they've moved on to a vendor or a supplier role, or sometimes even a competitor role, they're still a part of the ecosystem that your organization exists in. And so even in like the
But you're killing the fun. You're killing the fun of like them being dead to me.
no, I no, totally. I know it's always fun to watch like the security guard come over with the box and then walk them out
No, but you know what I
silently
mean? Like if
and
someone
pretend they don't exist. But
when someone willfully leaves, like that attitude, like I mean, like it's funny because like I'm very empathetic and I'm an emotional guy, but it's hard. It's hard not to think that they, well, they're just leaving for more money, or they're like you. It's hard to not have those feelings of like they have to be dead to me. Like I gotta move on. I mean, it's hard.
no, I'm totally, because we're tribal people, right? And you decided to move on to a different tribe,
You've
but
been voted off the island.
right, exactly. But I mean, the truth is actually we're networked people, and even when you look into tribes, there was the tribe we were in, but then we were also aware of the two or three other tribes that were sort of occupying our kind of territory, and I wouldn't call them competitive at that point, but we knew like we all benefit when we gain those sort of connections, and this goes way back to the research on sort of structural holes, and the people who occupy links between two different very clustered groups are hugely beneficial. But we never actually look at the people who disappear from our company as that. Like part of this is me working in a university setting. We always want people to be proud of graduating from our university, to be alumni, and we don't treat people who graduate out of a company. We don't treat it like a graduation. We do. We treat it like a betrayal. And I'm not sure that's the right mentality anymore, because we have this sort of, I'm trying to think of what Reid Hoffman called the tours of duty, this idea that sort of the organization may need you for a time and then doesn't need you anymore. And that's really kind of true. But at that point, it's probably better to have an organization that makes people proud that they were from there than proud that they sort of left, et cetera, right? And it's interesting. You see it in recruiting. Like one of the single best things that you can do for getting new talent is having talented people who graduated out of your organization still saying great things about you.
Was it hard when you were putting this book together and looking for these examples to sort of stay off or get off of the Silicon Valley drug? That's sort of like there's so much exciting things happening there. And like, was it hard to sort of remove yourself from it and look at it from a real practical way? Because it's alluring. Like you think about things like, putting restrictions on email because we have, or moving towards Slack, or unlimited vacations like you talked about, and on and on and on. And it's like, I look at those examples because I live and breathe in those worlds, but I also live and breathe in a world where, as a global agency and as many offices and countries that we're now in, and how we've done this deal with WPP, I'm like, wow, well, the real world doesn't. I mean, you become further and further from reality when you work with some of these bigger, smaller, niche organizations. They don't really embrace or jump on these sort of Silicon Valley-esque benefits and values.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. I think a lot of these ideas came out of those type of companies because they're if you're thinking about the shift from industrial work to knowledge work, they're the furthest on that shift, and so they're the ones who are most necessary to experiment. But the hardest part was I sort of knew intuitively that okay, if if these ideas work, then I have to be able to find them in other organizations. And so I was really careful to try and find, I mean, everything from a hospital to a supermarket to restaurant chains that try and implement these ideas.
But were you looking at them and thinking like, I just hope they're not doing this to be googly?
I mean, I think I don't know that there's a lot of ones we didn't write about. I think for that reason. I mean, to me, what the deciding factor wasn't whether or not the idea was cool for me. The deciding factor is I read about a lot of these different ideas, and then I have all of this past training in organizational psychology. It was really if I saw an idea and that triggered something I remember from the world of organizational behavior, then it sort of gets in, right? So like we don't, Zappos, and whether or not they know it, right? Zappos may pay people to quit because they're legitimately just trying to winnow out the field and they know nothing about the science behind confirmation bias and the idea that it actually works better when people don't take the deal because now they're looking for ways to confirm why it was a great idea not to take the money and run. They might not know that, but I do. We can see it. This field can sort of see it. And so it wasn't really about like who's just being googly. And actually, I mean, honest to God, I tried not to write about Google in this book. But
yeah, I'm using I say googly as like a metaphor for
no, but I mean they are
how do
they
we
are
attract talent, right?
Right. They are the sort of cliche of the crazy tech workplace sort of world, right? Whether they deserve the stereotype or not, we do sort of rely on them for it. And which is interesting because one of the things Google found was that they actually need a strong management role. They can't do the sort of self-managed teams thing, but that's a whole other monologue. My point is it wasn't necessarily about what are sort of like the craziest ideas. There's a lot of crazy workplace ideas out there that don't have any sort of science behind why they might work. My goal was to kind of bridge that gap. I always joke on my podcast that it's called Radio Free Leader, right? And we use a Cold War analogy. And so we joke that we're trying to tear down the wall between the ivory tower and the corner office. And that was really what this is looking at these ideas. And if I could see something in them from the world of social science, of organizational behavior, then it was worth writing about. If I couldn't, then yeah, it's them just trying to be googly.
So the word best practices shows up in your work. It shows up in all work that talks about business management. It's what other companies are looking for. And I was actually really somewhat relieved to see that you and I are very aligned on best practices because, again, as someone who does what I do, whether it's client-based or just out in the world speaking or doing what I do, I get asked that sort of like, well, what are the best practices for our industry? What are the best practices for others that sell to our type of customer? And I felt it was a cop-out for many years, my answer, because my answer was typically, I think because of digital, trying to follow a best practice is actually the worst thing you could do because of the world we now live in and access to technology and things you can do. You can actually really build a practice around your customers, your products and services and measure it in a way where you're not necessarily building your own best practices because that's contradiction to what I'm trying to say, but you're building your own path. There isn't that sort of, well, they did it with that audience or they did it as our competitor, so we can do that too. I actually think that doesn't exist at all. And again, I think best practices are interesting to look at as like, wow, like it's sort of aspirational that any organization can do something different, better, faster, quicker, cheaper, whatever it might be. But I really don't know if we can call them a quote unquote best practice anymore because of how the world has evolved. What do you think?
Yeah, totally. So well-kept secret that I'm going to reveal for you. The original working title of like when it was still just a proposal, the thing that we were pitching it on was the worst best practices. And it was on that idea that like these are things that seem like they're totally the opposite of whatever the hell best practices are. My agent really did not want the word worst to be in a book title, which is probably a good idea. But it really was, it sort of spoke to that idea that there's not a lot to learn from best practices in an ever-changing sort of environment, except actually, and Adam Grant actually does a great job talking about this in Originals, and there's been like 20 years of research, and he's the first person I think has taken it to a popular audience. That whole sort of first mover advantage is largely it's largely a mythology, right? That actually what you're better off doing is looking at the first mover or looking at the best practices and going, okay, what little tweak can we make that would differentiate and us in the minds of our consumers and actually sort of follower. Be better,
yeah,
right?
Follower.
What would so to me the idea of comparing ourselves to what people are doing. That's a race to the bottom. You're never going to sort of win and differentiate, especially when it comes to talent, right? If every single company just copies Google their people practices, then nothing happens. And actually, within like 5 or 10 years, Google's ones will be totally different because everybody's copying them. It's the idea that what you can really learn from best practices is, okay, if employee engagement's at this level and these are the best practices, then clearly we need to do something different in order to get that level up. Right. So all we learn from best practices is what to change, not what to actually do. Right. And so the idea of kind of benchmarking on all that, I don't know how much sense it makes. In an operations management world where you're trying to figure out how to run a factory and lower costs, it definitely makes sense. In a people management world, I don't think you can do enough differentiation to get that kind of niche of loyally committed people that you need.
There's a dichotomy that exists in the examples in the book and life and how we live. Everyone talks about productivity. Everybody talks about this work-life balance thing. And then here we are in your book looking at ways in which people are operating their business to what it seems to be as a macro theme, give people the freedom to have more time. Maybe more time to go on vacation, maybe more time to not answer emails, maybe more time to work and work hard on newer and more innovative ideas. And I look at that and I go, it's so interesting that we're in this place where it's like we're talking about ways to get better at productivity and efficiency and work-life balance. But I think, and I don't know what you think, people have never worked harder. I just feel like, whether it's the fact that we're connected or not, that this idea of like, I think about when I watch Mad Men, and it's like they left. First of all, what was going on behind the door in the office was crazy enough. It's like we're drinking, we're hanging out, we're talking, smoking. How often is work getting done? And then you would go home, and there was no connection unless they called the house or showed up, which was like emergency status was happening. And you just sort of transformed, not that long, a couple decades, a couple years, whatever it might be, to today where it's not even that we feel like, oh, my boss is on me and they're emailing me. We are intuitively taking out our devices and looking to see what's going on, responding and writing ideas and building plans and doing other things in hours that aren't allocated towards work. So, here you are with a book title, Under New Management, and it's looking at all of these things. And I guess I'm wondering, is it making us better or is it not?
Well, I mean, I guess I would counter and kind of go in a different direction that I don't. I mean, the idea that the 40-hour work week and the clear lines between work and life was something we should draw. It's actually a relatively new concept. Back before we had the Industrial Revolution and people working at factories and all that sort of stuff, the majority of people sort of lived right next to or right above whatever their vocation was. And it was always sort of blended. And I think that sort of the work-life balance thing is really hard to draw. Work-life integration, the idea of getting enough of it, but getting it at different times in different ways is sort of more important. And so what I kind of advocate for is less about, drawing definitive lines. Even the no sort of email chapter, there are people that email better at, that want to leave work at 2 p.m. to go be at home to meet their kids at school. And then when their kids go to bed, they want to do those, they want to catch up on the stuff. That's cool. I mean, if that's something that's sustainable for you, awesome. The point is that, like, because we're so scattered, I think this is the real problem. We're so sort of scattered, and we all now, because we can integrate, have different ways that we all do it, but we've never had a conversation about what are my limits, my individual boundaries, or what are the team boundaries that we're going to set in order to allow people to have that autonomy over their schedule. And I think it kind of comes down to that. It's not about sort of drawing a clear-cut boundary of, okay, after 5 o'clock, nobody talk and think or do anything about work. It's really about, like, we need to recognize that everybody treats their work and life integration differently. And so if the communication tools, for example, in the email chapter are limiting that, let's do that. And I talk a lot about a company or several companies that shut off their email servers. And that doesn't mean no one's allowed to send emails at night. It means if you choose to work at 11 o'clock at night, that's great. Your emails won't disturb people that choose not to work at 11 o'clock at night because they're not actually going to get sent until 8 a.m. the next morning. And so to me, it's more about that. Everybody figures out a balance between work and life sort of differently based on demands. And then also it changes over time. Before I had kids, it was way different than once I have children. And so it's kind of about giving people that autonomy back to determine their schedule.
And again, when I saw that, I was so mad. Like, I hated it. And hey, you write about it. I think it's important for you to bring these ideas. I just hate it because, I'm like that too. Kids, life, busy. And there are times where it's 2 a.m. and I just want to catch up on those 600 emails. And my reaction isn't that the server shouldn't block me. The person who is, if you're on the other end, if you're on the receiving end of it, there should be like a sort of social contract. My expectation is not that when I write an email at 2 in the morning that someone's going to respond to it right away, or even first hour, or even within 24 hours. It depends on, what the note is and am I just responding. One. Two is that I don't understand why we rely on technology to keep us from being adults. Like, so you decide, David, you and I have a relationship where we email each other, and I'm going to email you at 2 in the morning. You think that's ridiculous because you have kids. You have a little function called like the airplane mode. You have the ability to have your phone. My joke is when phones are beeping and stuff, I'm like, they don't have to do that.
Well,
Right? Like
true,
you
but
can
everybody
control
resorts
it.
to the default.
Yeah, but that's my point, is that like we're relying on the company to be this sort of like overlord to tell us what's right versus like, why can't we just have people get better at managing their technology?
I mean, that's fair, but it also when there's a power difference, right? When you have a clear-cut manager subordinate role, there are all sorts of subtle signals that get sent. And the way that your manager works is sort of, I think very few people have the confidence that they could tell their boss, hey, you know what? I'm not going to respond to anything you send after 5 o'clock until 8 a.m. the next day. I think
Right.
a lot of people don't have the confidence that they could say that and it'd be well received. And you're right.
It's
That
career
doesn't
limiting,
necessarily.
yeah.
Right, totally. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the entire company has to do it, but a lot of times there are things that when we decide that it's sort of a company thing that we're going to have this conversation, it makes it easier for those people who are in the sort of less power roles and who might be making those career limiting moves by saying that. It makes it easier to invite them to the conversation. And that's really what it's all about. I don't care what tool people use to communicate and collaborate as a team. It's more about we need a broader conversation, and I think that conversation can only be instigated by the company about what are our different communication needs and our communication preferences, and then let's go pick a tool that works the best. And that might be Slack. It might actually just be email with limits on it, and it might be email with no limits on it, but everybody like getting training on how to adjust their Outlook settings. That might be the only thing your company needs. But I think really unless there's a company-wide sort of initiative on it, that conversation isn't going to happen because a lot of people feel like they don't have the ability to speak up about it.
The last area that I want to cover with you is probably the most contentious one, at least to me in the book, which was this idea of salary transparency. And I'm sure you keep getting asked about this, and I know it's going to be something that comes up because whenever this stuff comes up, whether it's online or medium or fast company, the comments explode, and it's very, very polarizing. I get why people say it's good. I get the fact, especially when it comes to things like gender equality, experience, knowing in the hierarchy of an organization, if you work hard, you're going to reach this level. And even if you're at your level, this is what people are making. And it creates a sort of a fairness to it. But there's a people factor too. I think there's a jealousy factor. And then there's also just a personal factor where it's not a question of, I made this much money or I didn't make that much money. I just don't know that it's anybody's business. The type of deal that was negotiated, what the outcomes are. And again, I get that you would say, well, that's then not fair. I don't know if it's fair or not. I just don't know if I'm comfortable with anybody, and I'm not saying that because I'm in the position I'm in. I would tell you this, back when I was, out of university making under 30K a year. I mean, that was embarrassing too, I guess, in a certain degree. But you know what I mean? Like, why is this okay?
So first of all, a lot of those things, the comparisons, the jealousy, the whatever, that happens whether you have transparency or not. Like we have to start from the assumption that humans are humans and they're always trying to figure out this information. And that's really what started this whole thing. It's a whole thing called equity theory that the guy named John Stacey Adams started in the 60s, was that people are always looking to compare their ratio of inputs to outputs, what they get paid to the effort that they put in.
Are
and
you
then how that
talking about
compares
us
to other
comparing sizes again, Dave? Is that what
no,
we're
I mean
back?
basically no. We basically do that, and when we
Of course.
when we don't have salary transparency, we look. Instead of looking at exact comparison of sizes, right? What do? We look at hands, right? Or we look at other signals that somebody might be making money, and they might not. They might just be really like. I know a guy that didn't make a lot of money, but it was really good at making his suits look like they were custom tailored, and so
Sure.
everybody thought he made a ton of money, right? And so we always look for those things, and the truth is that we're terrible at judging that without the right information, right? So really, it's kind of this throwing up your hands and going, we're always going to make this and it's always going to create satisfaction. So the only real solution, or dissatisfaction, excuse me. So the only real solution is to go, you know what? Here's how we decide. And I don't know, like this is actually one of the one of the chapters that's most contentious even in me, like this is me being an academic. I don't know where I stand on this. I was not expecting to end up being a champion for transparency. And I have to start from the position that I think transparency is always good, but it's different companies need to have different levels of transparency. I think every company should at least, like you said, it's up to me and what I negotiate. I don't actually really like the negotiation thing because I think most companies should have some sort of uniform standard for here's how we quantify the value and how we measure the value that your role is sort of creating and hence what you get paid. And let people know what that is. You might not have to then go, okay, well, Mitch makes this and Dave makes this, but you can go, you know what, here's how we calculate everybody's formula. Here's how your formula, or here's how your salary was calculated based on this formula. So now you sort of know if you want to waste your time and do all the math, great. But I think it's really just about saying that we have this, so we're not just relying on someone's skills as a negotiator before they were even a part of our organization to determine their value. We have this sort of uniform system. And then the conversation shifts. And it doesn't mean the conversation's over. People will still have this conversation over what's fair and who's overpaid and whatever. But then the conversation becomes how do we collaboratively tweak that formula to something that's better, right? And so you look at like a company like Buffer, their formula has changed over time, right? And Buffer does post the salaries of everybody at the company. But the point is the discussion about the formula getting more fair, as it were, and getting more accurate is one that can only happen when you actually post the formula. If you're just keeping all of that sort of secret, then everybody's going to do this anyway, but they're not going to have the right data, and they're actually going to be more likely to be dissatisfied with stuff that's fiction.
Okay, fine.
Sorry, like I said, I wasn't
argument.
expecting to be an advocate of this one. And the other thing is that like it's actually better for the company too. It's mostly lab based, but there's a lot of good research that shows that when people know how to move up in a pay scale, they're more likely to perform well in order to do that.
But there isn't, I mean, there's shame. I mean, there's shame here, isn't there? Like there's shame in, I'm embarrassed sometimes, and not in terms of how much or how little, because I've been across the spectrum in my life, but there's an uncomfortableness in that.
I mean, I definitely agree that it's uncomfortable and it's something that we're not sort of used to. But I think it's for a lot of people in the organization, it's less uncomfortable than wondering if they're being discriminated against, wondering if they were a bad negotiator and so they're being paid less than their peers. There's a lot of things that are far more uncomfortable that we don't talk about. And you're right, this is going to be a little uncomfortable for some people. And most people have to start slowly and build towards transparency. They can't just sort of rip all of the covers off all at once. But I definitely think it's uncomfortable, but there are more uncomfortable things going on for a large percentage of an organization's workforce that will be basically eliminated by this one smaller uncomfortable thing.
Always good to catch up with you, Dr. Dave. New book's called Under New Management. Let people know where they can connect to all your wondrous stuff.
So, I mean, the best thing would be davidburkus.com. From there, you can go to, InstaFace, Snapgram, whatever the best medium you want to connect with me is, but start at davidburkus.com. We've got all sorts of stuff. And even if you're unconvinced and you don't want to check the book out, we've got all sorts of resources that are totally free on that page too. That'll give you some more hints about what the book's about. So check it all out and then let me know what you think.
Thanks so much for your time, Dave.
Thank you so much for having me.